Okay, if everyone could come back in, we're going to get started. We want to stay on schedule, lots to cover here. Okay, well, welcome to the economics panel. I'm Matthew Goodman. I'm the senior advisor for Asian economics and hold the Simon Chair here at CSIS. Delighted to have you with us for this continuing discussion. Let me go down the line and introduce my colleagues, and then we'll kick off. So to your left of me is Ernie Bauer, who's our senior advisor and Sumitro Chair for Southeast Asia Studies. Next to Ernie, Scott Kennedy, Deputy Director and Freeman Chair in China Studies and Director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy. Scott Miller, next to Scott Kennedy, is Senior Advisor and Scholl Chair for International Business. Next to Scott is Jane Nakano, who is Senior Fellow in the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. And finally, last but not least, the guy who clapped in the previous round for India, Rick Rossow, who's our Senior Fellow and Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at CSIS. So India will get its due in this panel, both economically and politically, we hope, as will Southeast Asia, which didn't get much attention in the last panel. So many of you have heard me joke that the previous panel dealt with life and liberty, and we're dealing with the pursuit of happiness here on this panel. Economic issues. Obviously, this region, broadly defined, accounts for roughly half the world's GDP, half the world's trade, half the world's population, and a region that has seen unprecedented growth and progress and increase in prosperity, and hundreds of millions of people brought into the middle class, and a well-known story. But we're really at a period of great uncertainty right now, economically, uncertainty about growth, uncertainty about financial stability, about regional integration efforts of one type or another, and we're going to try to touch on all of that here in the hour and a half that we have. We're delighted that you stayed, and thanks to Victor for giving a little teaser about our last question about black swans. Those of you who were not in the first round, we're going to be using these clicker devices. Again, you should have one, or you should have gotten one when you came in. We're going to put up a series of questions about growth, about trade, about infrastructure, about black swans, about energy. And you will be able to vote on what you think is the right answer, and then we'll tee off our discussion from that. The key thing, which people often forget, including me when I was in the last panel, is you need to turn the thing on when you start. So please press the little orange button at the top. It also tends to fall asleep if you haven't used it for a while, so each time we vote, remember to turn the power on. Okay, and the other thing that I'm going to say at the end as well is please do not take these clickers home with you. They have chips embedded in them, and Will Colson will track you down if you walk out with this. That's enough of a threat, I hope, to keep people. Just leave them in your chairs, please. Okay, let us, Will, if we can, start with the first question. Which major economy's growth will surprise, upside or downside, in 2016? And we've got basically the 5 biggest economies in the region. And so go ahead and vote. Remember, turn it on. Okay, I'll give another 2 or 3 seconds. Again, you only get one vote. You can keep pressing, but it's going to be your last press that's going to actually be registered. Okay, I think that's probably as expected, China, but the question in my mind is that an upside or a downside risk given expectations about China right now? So let's start with Scott Kennedy, of course.
I think my expectations for China this year are already pretty low. So I'm not going to be surprised if growth is pretty anemic. I'd be surprised if there were a crash, if things collapsed, or if it was highly robust, if the stimulus that they're rolling out really grabs hold and we hit 7% or plus or something like that. That's just not made up by the National Bureau of Statistics promoted by the People's Daily. So expectations for China are already low, so I would have probably voted someplace else, unless there's folks here who know something about policy direction of the Chinese government that I don't know. I think all the signs, not all the signs, but in 2015, I think there were two things about Chinese economic policy that grabbed hold that are still affecting us. The first is policy direction. We really don't know if China is committed to economic reforms because we saw a whole grab bag of a variety of different economic policies. The intervention in the stock market, in foreign exchange markets, the state-owned enterprise reform plan that was announced in September, it was quite murky. And so Chinese economic policy overall is about as clear as Beijing's air, which means it's not very clear. The second is the lack of precision and the problems China has communicating what it actually is trying to do. And there's this huge disconnect between what the Chinese state says and what markets are hearing. And so both in terms of substance and communication tools, China's a very mixed bag. So my expectations for growth are already pretty low. So I'd be surprised if things just fall off the table and you get a crisis because the Chinese have a lot of tools. I'd really be surprised if you get a very strong upside with very robust growth.
Okay, thanks. Rick, you came in second. What's the story with India?
I think we came in first in India here. I'm assuming most people presume India pointing up rather than down. If anybody strongly disagrees with that, I'm interested to hear. But I think overall the narrative, is that India, the numbers this year were quite good. Foreign investment in India, foreign direct investment was up. U.S.-India trade was up. GDP numbers were up, I think, to a surprising level, although part of that was due to a rework of the number in January that even finance ministry officials in India had a tough time sort of describing what exactly they did to change it from 4.5% to 7% in one fell swoop, but everybody's going with the number now. So presumably the fact that the numbers were pretty good despite people believing that his record on reforms was fairly lackluster, that you can only sort of go up from here too. They did some things in the last year on defense, for instance, on coal industry, the fact that oil prices are coming down, and India is actually a big value add for refining, so they do care about oil, both inputs and export. But still, you saw some things happen domestically on reform and internationally that are probably going to give India a bit of a bump. So I think there's some excellent things in play, but we all sort of hope that the icing on the cake. Can he get some more reforms out, some difficult parliamentary reforms with an opposition that's kind of stymied him recently? And if so, then I think more of a chance to surprise us upside rather than downside. So I presume that's what's on most people's minds. Certainly it's what's on mine.
Okay, we're going to have a next question about, I don't want to go to the next question yet, Will, but because I'm going to say something about the U.S., Japan, and Korea, but we're going to have a question about reform and reformers, which we'll bundle with this one, and then get your, and then we're going to ask a question about energy, and then bundle and get the audience's views. I mean, my own view is I think on the U.S. right now, expectations are that the U.S. is doing okay, doing better. The IMF's latest forecast shows us growing at a little under 3% in 2016, real growth. Obviously, there are some concerns and potential risks, concerns that the external environment may create some headwinds for the U.S., and worries that in the face of that, if the Fed is as it seems to be signaling pretty clearly, going to continue to raise interest rates, that could set things back. And then, despite the improvements in the labor market, you still have concern about the fact that wage growth has been pretty anemic still, especially at this point in a recovery. So I think there's some reasons for concern, but overall, against the rest of the Asia-Pacific, of which the U.S., of course, is a member, the world's largest economy seems to be doing pretty well, and it seems that's likely to be the story through this year. Japan, as the third largest economy in the world, also seems to be still within expectations of not dramatic growth. Nobody's really expecting a major comeback. But the numbers in the third quarter of this year, of 2015, were revised up into positive territory. Japan was not actually in a recession as was originally indicated. And they're now, the IMF in its last forecast predicted 1% real growth in Japan, which for a country with a population that's actually declining and is very mature as an economy, you could argue is about the potential rate of Japan. So Japan probably kicks along at that rate with, some potential risks, again, from the external side, or, you always have to worry about a natural disaster or something like that in Japan. But otherwise, I think reasons to think that Japan's going to do okay. Korea's been challenged. The IMF forecast is 3.2%. I think that, if anything, that might be a bit on the high side because, again, Korea is very dependent on China, and China's slowdown is going to hurt them. And there are other financial concerns there. There are worries about household debt in Korea, and the reform plans of President Park, while they have made some progress in some areas, still have not yet really kicked in a way that I think suggests a significant increase in growth. So, but all of these things we will, the IMF will be revising its numbers at the end of this month, and so we'll have a better sense of what they think for what that's worth. So let's flip, Will, to the second question, which is about reformers. And the question is, which self-styled economic reformer was the biggest dud of 2015? And you have a nice choice of candidates there. Remember to turn your clicker on and then make your vote. Well, good news, bad news, Ernie. Your guy is the favored candidate.
This is probably fair. Joko Widodo, who is also known as Joko Wee, really didn't deliver the goods on reform last year. He has focused more on Indonesian politics and sort of trying to get control of the political situation down in Indonesia. He has put through six reform packages in Indonesia. These have addressed the minor issues, the issues around the edges. They have not addressed core issues that investors want to see. And had Joko Wee used the political momentum that he was elected on to address those issues as an economic reformer right out of the gate, would have been challenging, I think, and I'll talk a little bit about why. But had he done that, Indonesia would possibly have been in your first slide, Matt, because Indonesia is now headed to just around $1 trillion economy. It's roughly half the size of the ASEAN economies, which together are just over $2 trillion. And Indonesia has the potential to see growth rates, China-like, old-style China-like growth rates of 7, 8, 9% if they get it just a little bit right. Every investor, every boardroom that's seriously considering Asia investments is now looking for growth in Asia outside of China. And those boardrooms end up looking right down into Indonesia, into India. And both places, Rick, I think you and I share frustrations on our the two big eyes here. They've been difficult to place that money and get that money to go to work. Now, Indonesia could get this right. There are signs that Joko Wee is starting 2016 with, and he has a new economic team. Those guys are making some of the right noises. But I think Joko Wee, the reason he didn't reform was that he was reading his electorate correctly. I mean, Indonesians are very proud that they've reached outside of the political mainstream and found a reformer. In Joko Wee, they were proud when they elected him. I think they've been disappointed that he has let the transparency and the anti-corruption campaigns that he promised lag a bit. That's being very generous. And he hasn't delivered the high levels of investment. But Indonesians they sort of had unreasonable expectations. There's this feeling in Indonesia, which, as you know, is the world's fourth largest country, that it's Indonesia's time. And Indonesians want you to make everything in Indonesia, put your data in Indonesia, do your banking in Indonesia. And there's this sense that's not realistic in an economic sense that almost an import substitution type mentality in Indonesia. I think the people running the economy know much better than this, and I think we'll see some good movement this year. So I predict if China doesn't hit the region too hard, and Indonesia itself is a massive consumer market with nearly approaching 270 million people, Indonesia will do really well this year.
Okay, great. Let me ask Scott Kennedy. I'm going to bring the other Scott's going to have a lot of time when we get to TPP. But let me ask Scott Kennedy about China, because I think that everybody sort of generally felt that Xi was serious about reform because he needed to succeed economically in this transition to a new growth model. And the plan, so acknowledging that you have a problem is the first step to alcoholic recovery. And so the Chinese get credit for that. They had a plan, which in the 13th Party plan, which was long, extensive, ambitious, but pretty sensible. Everybody knew it was going to be difficult, but it seems to be caught up not only in the sort of expected things like vested interests and all of that, difficulty in following through in any country on some of these reforms, but now questions about the competence of reformers in China that's arisen. That's something kind of new and different, and I wonder if you could talk about any or all of that.
Yeah, I didn't vote for Xi Jinping. I think the bar is pretty low. There's a lot of folks you could pick in the region on this, but disappointed would certainly. I think our definition of what reform is, I think sometimes we get lost. Policy change in and of itself does not equal reform. There's been a lot of policy changes, but a lot of them aren't really reformist. There's been a shift to services and consumption as overall part of the economy, but that really doesn't equal reform either. What really equals reform in the Chinese context is liberalization, the withdrawal of state intervention across a variety of sectors. And there, it's been extremely uneven, and in many areas, greater intervention than we had before. Feeling pessimistic about China, perhaps spending so much time in Washington, I thought, boy, I need to go look for optimism. So I went on a happy trip last month to look for some bright signs and not in Beijing as well. So I went to other parts of China, and the first taxi driver whose cab I got into, I asked him about how do you compare Xi Jinping to Hu Jintao and the previous leadership. And when I asked that question of a lot of business people several years ago, all of them had much more hope for Xi Jinping, and only one out of 60 gave Hu Jintao much credit. And the first person I asked said Hu Jintao was much better than Xi Jinping. And I said, why? He says, because he really understands the economy. And I said, oh my God, if someone thinks Hu Jintao really understands the economy, we got some real problems. Now, hopefully there wasn't a chip in me, because this taxi driver might have some problems now. But I then went and talked to a bunch of entrepreneurs, and we were around a table, and as we were talking, they were all looking at their phones, and news was coming across their phones about the detention of Guo Guangchang, who is the head of Fosun, one of China's largest companies, who was just detained for no other reason than the authorities wanted to talk to him, and eventually he was released. But these folks thought, if this person can be picked up, if the Warren Buffett of China can be picked up, anybody can be picked up. And so there's a lot of concerns. So what I want to say that I'm not totally pessimistic. My hope is for China this year is the slack between what's going on in Beijing and what business people are actually doing on the ground, trying to ignore what's going on in Beijing, trying to adapt, innovate, tighten their supply chains. And surprisingly, one of the things I came away with is that multinationals, American companies, are doing a better job of this than Chinese companies. So even though it looks like there's a lot of nationalism and foreign companies are facing greater challenges in China, they're actually doing a better job of adapting to this quote-unquote new normal than their Chinese counterparts.
Okay, well, I'm sure there's going to be a question and discussion about that when the audience pulls in. But let me ask Rick about Modi and what's gone wrong there.
Well, I think from the American perspective, I mean, at the highest level, he's pro-investment and anti-trade. And sometimes we mix those things together. He comes out against the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, a year and a half ago, and we think that he's anti-business. But actually, when it talks about encouraging investment, liberalizing foreign investment caps, he's done more of that in 1 year than the last government did in 5 years, for sure. In fact, just after they lost the key state election, 2 days later, he announced 30 different sectors where they're lifting the FDI caps. None of them were, among the most significant, perhaps, but still, he's put the pedal down on investment kind of thing. So pro-investment, but we still have no inkling that he's going to be opening up and really kind of more robust on trade agreements, that kind of thing. The other thing I say about, his reform program, it's a mixture of slogans and deals, right? He's got these big slogans, Make in India, Smart Cities, Digital India, and not as many reforms that are directly related to those things. The Make in India campaign, well, they got one big reform that's sitting before them right now, amending the Constitution to take some tax authority away from the states and create a national goods and services tax, which for manufacturers that cross state lines, it's the biggest thing they could hope for. It would have been nice to announce this big manufacturing campaign, maybe on the backs of getting that thing done, rather than announcing a big Make in India campaign, hey, everybody come to India and build, before you've really done a lot of the groundwork to make it happen. But, it's slogans and deals. The deals are there. So if an investor comes and meets with Modi and says, I want to put some money in, I got this thing I'm looking at doing, if it makes sense, he'll take care of those kind of things. And that's what I think you're largely going to see from Prime Minister Modi is a focus. He's not a big picture thinker. I talked about this just after he was elected, having worked with him a lot in Gujarat. If you had two ministers sit across the table from him and the conversation was about how do you grow the IT sector, and one minister had the traditional India 800-page plan, well, let's do these 400 things and change these rules and do this thing and do that thing. And the other minister had a map and said, well, let's build 2 cities here and here, connect them with high-speed internet, and build a light rail around it. He'll pick the project, because that's what he does. So you're seeing that for him is what he envisions as kind of reforms. Done some liberalization investment when he thinks that'll bring it in, but by and large, it's been very piecemeal otherwise. There's some notable successes. If you're in the coal industry, you just had the biggest year in history, and it's a huge sector in India. If you're a coal company, he's the greatest performer in world history. If you're care about cross-border taxation, insurance even, right? It's very piecemeal. So there's individual sectors too that have seen big changes, but a whole lot that haven't.
Okay, let me say a word about Abenomics. As everyone knows, 3 years ago, Prime Minister Abe came in Japan on a platform of economic reform. It was the centerpiece of what he said he was going to do and focus his attention on. And his plan that he came up with was dubbed Abenomics, with 3 arrows of monetary and fiscal stimulus, basically, and structural reform. I think he appointed a central bank governor that was willing to really do some creative and aggressive things on monetary policy, and that had some early success. And they have essentially gotten out of the deflationary mode they were in, but still haven't been able to get sort of lift off towards sustainable, modest inflation. And so that's still a concern. Partly that's due to something we're going to talk about in the next question that Jane's going to come in on oil prices declining, which is a mixed blessing for a lot of countries, and including for Japan, because it's obviously helped them on the import side, but it's actually made the price challenge a little more difficult, ironically. And then fiscal policy has been sort of, modestly supportive, but perhaps could be somewhat more supportive. But of course, this is against the backdrop of a huge overhang of debt that Japan is eventually going to have to work off. Though in the short term, for many years, the continued short term, it has not posed an immediate risk to their economy, and I think that is going to remain the case for the future, for the indefinite future. Then the third arrow of structural reform, which is the key really to getting Japan's productivity up, especially in the face of a declining population, absolutely critical just mathematically to get growth. You have to get people, whoever's left in Japan is going to have to work harder, is what it boils down to. And so that means you've got to remove the impediments to people being able to work harder, which is labor market reforms and reforms in regulation, in the agriculture sector, and corporate governance. There has been some progress, some notable progress. Agriculture reform, Abe's taken on the vested interest, the farm lobby, which doesn't really represent real farmers, but part-time farmers who have other things going on and do farming for tax reasons. And he's helped bring them down a peg and rationalize production, and that's been, together with TPP, which we're going to talk about soon, has made, a real change. And for those of us who have been watching Japan for a long time, I don't think we would have expected this much progress on agriculture under Abe. So that's been good. Corporate governance, we had an event here last month highlighting some of the interesting things going on in terms of making companies more responsive to returns on equity, making boards more diverse, bringing in more outside directors and so forth. So there's some interesting things going on there. But overall, still some pretty fundamental challenges, and fundamentally it's in the labor markets. I think the challenge of creating greater flexibility so that people can move jobs, can change jobs, and take with them their incomes, their benefits, and their dignity, which is a real obstacle to labor mobility in Japan. So I think these things still have a lot of work to be done. And so Abe, I think the jury's out on Abe, so I think that score is basically a fair one. Why don't we move on to the energy question, and then I'm going to bring the audience in. So next. What will the average price of a barrel of oil be on December 31st, 2016? The price is a little under $32 a barrel as of yesterday, the Brent crude. I think anybody who was answering this question 12 months ago and who came anywhere close to the right answer would deserve a Nobel Prize or something, because I think nobody predicted this plummeting drop. Jane may correct me; she may have had the right number, but I think this was a profound change in the oil markets that was really unexpected. So let's actually, I haven't voted. I'm going to, since I got some inside information from Jane earlier, I'm gonna add my weight there. Okay, Jane, why don't you tell us what's going on, what's caused this decline, and what's the outlook?
Sure. Well, there are a lot going on. So since the summer of 2014, the price of oil has come down by about half, and it's, of course, the direction of the price levels is driven by a number of things. Not just supply and demand, but then also sometimes it's well, there's the geopolitics as well. For commodities such as natural gas, the weather plays a big factor as well. But here, we're obviously talking about the global oil price, particularly Brent. That's the global benchmark, and it's a very interesting result. I think many of us are closely reading. Newspapers, whether it's Nikkei or FT, and it's, there are a couple of factors that we should really keep a close eye on, and certainly, Iran is the interesting one. The nuclear sanctions compliance is the timing of it, and of course, when and if is a big question. I guess as of yesterday, I guess this senior State Department official, I hope I'm not mistaken, but commented that the I guess Iranian compliance could be seen or acknowledged in the coming days, and of course that has to be verified by IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, based in Vienna. But if Iran does re-enter into the global oil marketplace, that's big. But I guess if we're looking at just 12 months from now, I think there's it's not. Iran still has quite a bit of work to do, such as to keep its mature oil field. So, it could be more of a longer run. But having said that, Iran is a major hydrocarbon resource holder, so that their pace of return could really put the downward pressure on the price level. And I'm not saying necessarily farther from where we are today, but could really slow down the price level recovery. Another really interesting player to keep an eye on is Russia. Russia is another major hydrocarbon resource holder, and there is, of course, sanctions on Russia as well. Russia, it's interesting to note that their recent oil output level was the post-Soviet record high. One may wonder why, right? I mean, they're under sanctions, but actually these sanctions and has made the rubles a lot cheaper, so the production cost has been in their favor. So they're keeping they keep producing both oil and gas, and And if I were Russians, I mean, they have no reason to really slow down. I mean, after all, oil gas export revenue is a major source of their treasury, the federal government budget. Also, even if they slow down in the hopes that oil price comes back, there's only so much they can control. I mean, obviously, in recent years, there are a lot of non-OPEC players that do play very important roles, but in many ways, they're competing against a lot of major OPEC producers who are really, in this sort of a market share race. And I should have noted that, so looking at Iran, not just the pace, but then how OPEC may accommodate Iran will be another interesting thing to keep an eye on. And of course, the U.S. I mean, U.S. is a major producer, and of course, the decline in the oil price level since summer of 2014 has started to keep the production level sort of more modest, and more recently sort of lower, especially in shale side. But it's exciting to note that actually the oil production in the U.S. is declining rather slowly, and then also the offshore production in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico is sort of making up for the decline, the slow decline in the shale side. And what puts U.S. apart from some of these traditional producers is that it's a lot more nimble. So if the producers start seeing the global oil price level starting to come up, U.S. producers will be probably one of the first to get back into the game. Of course, that could again, lead to the more of a downward pressure. So for a while, it's not likely to see a sort of a quick recovery in the oil price level, but I wanted to also say that, and then also downward, the demand side. Of course, China is the big story, and China has been a major energy consumer, importer. I think recently there's a growing anxiety among oil analysts about the potential of the hard landing in China. And but having said that, even before the sort of a Chinese economic slowdown, Chinese economy has been, compared to the past, becoming a lot more energy efficient. And also, it's more of a longer trend. But their economic growth has been starting to be decoupled from energy consumption. So there's a lot of efficiency sort of improvements there. But China on the demand side is the biggest the factor that we should keep an eye on. But then, of course, all the bets are off if there's a major event in some of the oil-producing regions in the world. But then let me put that in a context in that, we've seen Syria, we've seen a lot of incidents in the Middle East, but, the oil price has been pretty, low. I think the biggest message for, I guess, particularly for sort of an Asia audience is that I think this is sort of mixed blessing, as Matt mentioned. Of course, it does help governments, especially energy import-dependent governments, sort of a breathing space. The commodity prices have come down, et cetera, especially oil, but also gas. But, roughly 70% of the oil and gas fields around the world are mature fields. So if the low price environment continues for a number of years, hypothetically, and obviously that question is, later this year, but then, that will start having very negative impact on the capital upstream capex spending. Already 2015, we saw capex spending reduction from anywhere from 20% to 40%. It depends on which region, but for example, the U.S. I think the latest, the number that I saw was like 40% reduced spending last year. And this year we're seeing additional lower spending. That means that many of the fields that have to have more money reinjected to keep the production level going, but then also new fields to be developed, they will, they won't be getting the investment that they need. And so certainly, if this low oil environment continues for a long time, we could see sort of a sharp rebound in oil prices. That would not really help any of us.
So against that backdrop, I mean, the audience is somewhat against. It sounds like the story you told largely suggests that prices are going to remain suppressed, but the audience is predicting actually a rebound. What do you think is behind fundamentally?
Sure.
there?
No, thanks for the. I mean, that's. But I think the $30 level is a very tough one to sustain. But low oil price will probably facilitate stronger demand than otherwise. So in many ways, like for example, the Energy Information Administration, that's part of DOE but very policy independent. Their short-term energy outlook it gets released once a month, and the one from early December has $56 per or $56 to $57 per barrel as I shouldn't say possible number, but it's the forecast number for December 2016, and then many of the other sort of mainstream oil watching analytical shops around the world certainly have higher number than where we are. Probably both C and D could be right in that sense. But the latest, the STIA, the short-term energy outlook, comes out today. So I'm actually sort of looking forward to seeing the latest. But yes, yeah, exactly.
Well, you gave me that EIA number before, so I actually voted for D, but just to be contrarian. But I applaud the audience for its boldness in suggesting a counter trend to what we've seen, because that's not typical in forecasting. So good for you. We'll see what happens. Okay, let me bring the audience in. Please hold your questions about TPP. The next question is going to be about TPP, and we'll talk about that. But if you have other questions about the growth outlook, about energy markets, about reform, then please feel free. There's a gentleman here, and then a lady there, and then I'll take all three together. So if the microphone could be brought also to this lady here.
Hi, I'm Max Moran. I'm an intern for the Better World campaign. Yesterday, I think, or the day before, Morgan Stanley issued a report saying that oil prices could be seen as low at $20 to $25, depending on the fluctuations in the U.S. dollar. So how do you see the energy market reacting to geopolitical circumstances that would see the dollar fluctuating?
All right, let's cluster that with this question, and then over there.
Barbara Stallings from Brown University. This is a question for Scott Kennedy. I'm interested in your opinion about the reliability of China's economic statistics. Everyone seems to agree that there's some problem there, but there's quite a range of opinion, ranging from people who say on GDP, for example, maybe it's nearer to 6% rather than 6, 9, or 7. I've seen people who say it's nearer to 1.5 or 2%. I'm interested in sort of where you line up on this range.
Good morning, Paula Stern. My question is about China's policies with regard to their undertakings in Paris and generally back at home on climate change, and what that may mean for their economy. How quickly do you expect them to turn away from carbon-based dependence, and how that will affect their economic growth projections going forward? How do you bake that into your discussions on oil as well as generally China growth projections.
Okay, I'm going to take one more, and then we're going to answer these.
Thanks. I'm Mary Kay Magstead. I'm with Public Radio International's The World. I'm a former China correspondent. So a question for Scott Kennedy. I'm interested in where outside of Beijing you were seeing signs of economic vibrancy, and also more generally, for at least 15 years, the Chinese government has had a project of trying to encourage more innovation. It's put many billions of dollars into this. Are you seeing signs on the ground that this is starting to happen? And then just very quickly for Jane, and building on the last question, I'm just interested, you focused exclusively on oil and gas, especially after the Paris climate change agreement. Are you seeing that there will be sort of an acceleration of investment in solar in particular and wind, not just in China, but around the world?
Okay, so let's cluster these. Jane, if you want to take the currency oil question, which is the first one, and then this last one about alternative energy investment, and then we'll turn to Scott to do the China cluster, and then others, if you want to join in, feel free.
So, so let me just make sure, so I got the $20 barrel per day question. So it's whether that could lead to a major geopolitical incident if the price goes.
No, so my question was Morgan Stanley essentially claims that $20 a barrel is possible.
Oh, okay.
Strong dollar.
Right, okay, red currency, okay, yeah, thanks, yeah. I think it's almost like anything's possible, but I think that's really a tough level to go because there's so many, yes, there's a strong dollar factor, but then there's so many countries that still have major share of the global oil market, but then with very substantial spare capacity, such as Saudi Arabia, whose sort of the domestic system highly, depends on much higher level of oil, so oil price. So I think 20 is possible, but I think it's highly unlikely. And then, of course, if it goes that way, it doesn't have to hit 20, but once you start seeing it, I guess, consistently under 30, there could be, a lot of instability instances and incidents that we wish we never had to see, to put it mildly. China question. China did play a very important role at COP21, and certainly, prior to the Paris discussion, there was a lot of engagement with the U.S. government as well, and I think in many ways, the domestic, what they have in place at home is, certainly, a lot more, I guess that's where things will count, whether they can deliver on those rather than sort of the more of a treaty and that sort of international foreign policy thing, in my view. But, how quickly China can really peak its coal consumption. I think their desire is genuine. But having said that, coal is still the cheapest, easiest to store. I mean, and the electricity access challenge is huge in China, but then also, as well as countries like India. But so coal will stay around, but to what extent non-coal can make its way into the electricity system is one important area. They do have a huge nuclear power generation program, and they have about 30, I believe, that are operating today, but they have about 25 under construction. The latest policy or the target is to build about 6 to 7 every year until 2020, and then after that, maybe 10 units a year. Sure, nuclear is a clean or, the almost like low to non-carbon emitting source of electricity. That's where they are putting a lot of money in. But there's certainly renewables too. Combining with the third question that I got, the global investment into renewables is very real. I think the cost of variable renewable the technologies for the variable renewables, such as wind and solar, is coming down quite a bit. But China is actually leading the global trend in that. And in many ways, the current challenge for the renewables is to get the sort of the pie larger. And in many ways, I think, of course, there are some challenges like level playing field and et cetera, but to the extent that all these economies with some resources can really sort of improve the cost curves and then, then come up with many, better ways to, say, store electricity from variable renewable resources, I think it's a really good message for any of the countries that are looking to certainly be part of the post-Paris, part of the Paris framework and forward. So, thanks.
Sure. Let me answer both questions, but together rather than just one, because there's both of you asking some things that are together, and I want to, in terms, so when I, on this trip where I went to take some happy pills and look for positive signs, I went to Shanghai, and then I went to Zhejiang province. These are the areas which should be doing the best in China, which they have historically, and so I wanted to, go and see what could possibly the best situation in China be, and then use that as a benchmark to compare everything else, because if nothing could be better, all right, and so. And I saw a very, very mixed picture. I saw some things which were positive signs. I saw some things which were negatives and worried me, like as I had mentioned. In terms of the overall actual activity and data, should we believe the data? Dan Rosen from the Rhodium Group issued a report with us last fall that I commend everyone to look. It's on our website, recalculating Chinese GDP. And he spent a lot of time in the process of doing that, analyzing China's statistics system, doing a lot of interviews, tracing the historical evolution. And I agree with his basic finding, which is the quality of the data overall has improved. That there's probably less bold-faced lying and just inventing data out of thin air than one would think. But volatility is tamped down. So when you look at independent analysts, whether it's Morgan Stanley or others, the IMF, the World Bank, the Chinese line goes up and down much more than a Chinese official data. And I think that's sensed from on the ground. I don't think 1% to 2% or even a recession overall is accurate. Certainly, if I'd gone to the Northeast, China's Rust Belt, I would have, yes, negative. Things are very bad there. But overall, there are still signs of genuine growth. Consumption is going pretty strong. The official data is about 10% growth, and that it looks like 10% growth from the places I was going and other people I've been talking to. Real wage growth is still going on. Folks talking to who are in construction, infrastructure, they're still getting new deals and they're still getting paid. That's really important. So accounts receivable, they're not getting IOUs. They're actually getting money into their bank account, which is a very good measure if things are really, really dangerous. Now, the government may be telling them, you pay no matter what, and our bank will continue to funnel you money, even if you actually don't have income to do that. But nevertheless, at the moment, that hasn't broken down. So I still think that we're not at the 2008 sides of recession in China. Going forward, innovation has got to be a critical part of a long-term growth strategy. Chinese filings of patents and other types of copyrights and trademarks have gone through the roof. They're the #1 patenters these days globally. They understand if you measure value added in China as part of their participation in global production networks, that's gradually risen. But they know they still have a lot to go with, and that's why the 13th five-year plan that they're going to be issuing in a couple months, and that I'm doing a major report together with Chris Johnson in the Freeman chair, that we'll be issuing in April. That's the #1 priority of the 13th five-year plan. Last week when I was in Beijing having a meeting about this, we had a set of officials talking about innovation. Everyone in China, from the lowest level official to the top level official now, knows about innovation. They know the bullet points. They've all been fed them. They can recite them all in the same order. So top down, they've got innovation, right? They know it's critically important. Some of them just are mouthing the slogans. Some of them actually believe it. One of the signs that shows me that there's some some change, though it's not fully believed, is Chinese are talking about comprehensive innovation. Not just technology, not just developing more scientists, but improving the education system, having more access to information globally, and thinking about innovation in terms of creativity. And that's really important. If you go, there was a study that came out late last year that's about the Global Creativity Index, and that measures creativity along 3 criteria: technology, talent, and tolerance. China scored very high on technology, but low on talent, low on tolerance. I think we can all figure out why. So China's overall score was ranked number 62. All right, that's 2 other BRIC countries, Brazil and India, were much higher in that overall index, right, in the top score. So if China's going to get higher and become more creative and become an innovative society, then it's got to think about it more holistically. And they, as we were saying before, yes, they know where they need to go, but getting from there to the next step is super hard, and there's some of them who really want to do it, and some of them who are just mouthing slogans.
Okay, great. Lots to cover. Mike, was your question about this set of issues, or let's take the one question from Admiral McDevitt over there. Thanks.
Hi, Mike McDevitt from CNA. Question for Ernie on Indonesia. I didn't want you to feel left out there. You were very bullish on the future of Indonesia, but it struck me. I've heard the same sorts of stories about Brazil and India and Indonesia in the past, and then given your downbeat assessment of what Jokowi has actually done, why are you so optimistic? I mean, the potential is obviously there, but they have infrastructure problems, they have political problems. Other than sounding the drum that they have potential, is there any practical reason why anybody should be optimistic?
Yeah, I think so. You know, Jokowi has assembled a very impressive group of analysts. It's sort of a National Security Council type structure within the palace. It's housed in a building called Bina Graha, and collectively these young PhDs are called sort of the Bina Graha group. You know, they worked for Luhut before he went over to the coordinating ministry. And Jokowi actually has access to and uses data to make decisions at a level I have never seen before in Indonesia. And Mike, I think that coupled with the arrival of Tom Lembong, he's the new trade minister, and like past trade ministers, is extremely articulate. He can speak to foreign investors. That doesn't mean, as we've seen in the past, that things are going to happen. But I think Jokowi is starting to connect the dots, and we see the first economic packages that he's passed have been really around the margins. But now these guys are looking at some real issues like tax collection, like actually opening up some sectors for foreign investment, rationalizing to some extent some of the SOEs. These are the areas where the Jokowi will really have to grapple with. He'll have to use his political capital he has left to move forward on this. And I think Indonesians aren't really investment. What they are is pro-Indonesian, and that's not a bad instinct. So I think these guys are starting to, at Bina Graha, at the leadership level, starting to understand how to put these things together and connect the dots. So I predict, outside of really a totally miserable year for Asia economically, which I don't think we'll see. I think we'll see not a great one, but I think Indonesia will do relatively well. And I think foreign investors will find their way in Indonesia in 2016.
Okay, great. Let's move on to trade, and we'll do the 2 questions on trade. But first, TPP. This is a yes/no question. Will the U.S. Congress approve TPP implementing legislation in 2016? No particular month in 2016. You cannot vote C, D, or E. You have to choose. So I want those A and B bars to add up to 100. Come on. Okay, we have some optimism here, Scott Miller.
Yeah, it's a pretty bullish audience. There's one vote for D, which I think is, hey, I ordered a cheeseburger. Oh, it just went away, sorry. Okay, well, before we speculate on TPP, first of all, I would say this is an optimistic audience versus the chatter around town. But the politics are going to change as the year goes on, and that's what we'll probably talk about. First thing I want to focus on is, before we start speculating, is what we actually know. And there are 3 dates that we know. The first date is February 3rd. February 3rd would be 90 days after the president announced his intention to sign TPP. So that's the first date at which the agreement can actually be signed. So which would indicate that we're still at an early stage, but February 3rd is that first date. Second date is May 18th. May 18th is the date at which the economic analysis from the USITC is to be distributed. So there's still work going on. The third date, which I think is the most important for the politics, is July 15th. July 15th is the date that both the House and the Senate will adjourn for political conventions and district work period. This used to be called the summer recess, but I think Congress figured out that the only 2 groups in America that got recess were kindergarten and Congress, and they renamed it the district work period. So in any case, but keep in mind, the Congress will be out of session from July 15th till just after Labor Day, September 6th. It'll be a short session, very few legislative days in the calendar year, and once again, as with almost every election year, the session after Labor Day will also be very short. Adjournment tends to take place about the first week in October, so members and senators can return to the district for the fall campaigns. In any case, so not much time. Now, what should you look for as this time elapses? And I think the first thing, the clear signals will begin to emerge in late March or early April. In March or April, I'm expecting committee hearings by the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee on the agreement itself. Those will be important hearings, but the most important part is it will focus the attention of Congress on the agreements among the committees of jurisdiction. Shortly after those hearings, or perhaps coincident with the hearings, the various vote counters will start counting votes. And so shortly after that, sometime in March or April, the experts, the members who do this for a living, are going to figure out how far we are from 218 in the House and 51 in the Senate. So at that point, everybody starts making decisions. The Congress has to make some priority calls about what it wants to get done, how much effort it wants to devote to it, how much political capital to spend. Same with the administration, okay? And they're going to start to know. So this, in other words, given the process we're in now and the timetable of an election year, it's going to be sometime in the spring when the political feasibility of TPP in 2016 will start to take shape, and those decisions will get made, and basically the administration and the Congress will decide whether they want to make it happen or not. So I think that's what I would watch for. Interestingly, that aligns pretty closely with what's happening in our primary election season. Now, I would note that it started out when there were a few comments and questions about TPP to political or to presidential candidates when the agreement was first finalized and first announced in October, and then during the month of October to early November. It came up once in a while for questions. But it didn't come up in a serious way. It didn't come up in a sustained way. It was sort of stray voltage. But when it came up as stray voltage, interestingly, the position everybody gravitated to was, it's not good enough. Mrs. Clinton was clearly at that point trying to secure some support from active groups within the Democratic Party, and not good enough was a good landing spot for her. Donald Trump actually had a pretty similar position. He basically said, my U.S. Trade Representative Carl Icahn could have gotten a better deal, or something to that effect. But that was the landing zone. That's not surprising, but it quickly disappeared from the scenes. What I want to point out about our primary process this year is it starts, despite all the polls on the Drudge Report, it doesn't really start till February 1st. February 1st is the date of the Iowa caucuses. But by March 15th, only 6 weeks later, more than half of primary voters across the United States will have cast a ballot. the primaries are unusually front-loaded this year. I think because a lot of states got tired of Iowa and New Hampshire hogging all the glory, and they wanted a voice in this too. So now you have many large states, Ohio, Texas, Florida, all have relatively early primaries, much earlier than 4 years ago. That will mean, first, that we'll be in general election mode before you know it, and perhaps before Congress holds a hearing. You'll have candidates, which makes it less likely to become up as an issue which differentiates candidates. But also importantly is many House members and senators will also have their primaries on the same date as the state primary, and they will be on primary competition. All right? This is very important in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, district lines are drawn by state legislatures. That's the way our Constitution works. And while there are a few state legislatures which have created commissions, by and large, those state legislatures have an agenda, and the agenda is incumbent protection. Now, this incumbent protection racket means that it's very unlikely members actually lose general elections, but they can be challenged in a primary election, and that's what members often worry about, is if you're a Democratic member who supports trade, an anti-trade primary candidate is a worry. Same for Republicans, and challenges from the right. So once members get past their primary, politics, particularly in the House of Representatives, gets marginally easier. So this cycle, I'm just trying to give you context for interpreting a lot of data we don't have yet, is that the politics get generally easier in the spring, called by April. Then they start to get harder as you get closer to the general election. Is there any evidence this has happened before? Why, yes. In 2000, last year of President Clinton's term, okay, there was an important trade issue that was presented to the Congress. It was permanent normal trade relations with China, this famous PNTR vote. In November of 1999, the National Guard was called out for riots in the city of Seattle, which took place, the proximate cause was China joining the WTO. You'll remember the Seattle Ministerial. All right, that was just November, so just if you compare this versus 16 years ago, that was 2 months ago. Okay, all right. By the spring, and thanks to an amazing effort by the Clinton administration, that both Republican House and Republican Senate passed permanent normal trade relations. Believe it or not, no fast track protection. The Senate picked up and passed the House bill without amendment. When's that happened? But it happened in 2000, and great credit to both the congressional leaders and to President Clinton for making that happen. So things can happen in election years. That, I think, supports some of the enthusiasm you see. Will they happen? Nobody knows yet. There's some discomfort. It's interesting chatter about renegotiation. I would point out that of 3 issues of particular controversy, only one of the 3 was a subject of debate among trading partners. The data protection for biologics was an issue with our partners in the TPP, but the other 2 more controversial issues, the data issues on financial services, was basically a debate between the USTR and the Treasury, which the Treasury won, right? And the tobacco control provisions, which have a political economy problem with people like Majority Leader McConnell and others, was basically a debate between HHS and USTR and not really affecting our trading partners. So is there room? Hey, anything can happen. So let me leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Excellent, really rich set of data points that I think will help this. I voted for A. I'm optimistic. I think the optimistic position on TPP in substance has been the right one to take, in that it is done, and now it's it's moved forward despite some skepticism. It's the timing that is the one you don't want to put your money on, because who knows when the timing will happen. But I think, to reinforce what Scott said, I think there are incentives that are aligning. Obviously, you're going to hear the president make a pitch for TPP this evening in the State of the Union. I think the Republican leadership wants TPP for a variety of reasons. They like trade. They want to show they can get something done. There's some specific concerns, but I think you could certainly see in the House some movement, because Paul Ryan really wants it. And then the business community is finally coming out strongly for this. I mean, at least the panoply of important business groups have come out, and I think once they start mobilizing and weighing in, I think that's going to have a big impact, especially on the Republican side of the debate. Sure, Ernie.
you made great points there, and Scott always is like an encyclopedia on this. I would just point out, too, that since this is the Asia forecast, I think it's important that the president will make 2 trips to Asia this year, at least. And he's going in May, he's going in September. In May for the G7 in Japan, and then I think to Vietnam, although that's not announced. I think that's where he's headed, in addition to Japan, and then in September to China for the G20, and also to the ASEAN meetings in Laos for the ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit. I think these will be opportunities to drive, to drive the TPP debate and focus Americans on the real substance of the point here, which is that the United States' future, economically and from a security standpoint, really depends on Asia. And I think the president is starting to find his voice on this. I, too, expect him to address this tonight, and that could be helpful. He's got some people in Congress, Paul Ryan and others, who I think will work with him on this if he gets it right.
I want to talk about sort of the region and how others fit into this story out in Asia. But Will, I'm sorry to throw you off, but could we put the other trade question, skip the one about infrastructure and put the one up about bad trade policies, and then we'll have a general discussion about sort of what's going on in the region on trade. So here, make sure your clickers are on again, and then pick your sort of bad behavior here.
There is no D.
Here you can vote for D if you don't understand what any of these things are. We're going to explain. So, no, seriously, try to pick one so we can have a conversation. Okay, again, either of our Scotts could answer this, or Rick might have a view as well. Scott Miller, though, do you want to just talk about innovation mercantilism? Explain what it is
Sure.
first, I think.
Look, this is mercantilism is a practice basically of creating economic policies which favor home country manufacturers or marketers or firms over foreign competition. And while that happens broadly, it's a bad policy. Doesn't matter that David Hume and David Ricardo and Adam Smith all won the argument a couple hundred years ago. It's still widely practiced. It's incredibly politically popular. Having said that, innovation mercantilism is a unique threat because of the importance of ideas, intellectual property, innovation to our economy and to global competitiveness. The United States economy is uniquely the way we add value, basically, in our economy is with intangibles. And so innovation mercantilism uniquely hurts the United States. But for this, it would be policies such as China's security and industry rules for secure and controllable equipment effectively excludes foreign technology products. Or India, which introduced local content requirements as part of its national telecom machine-to-machine roadmap. Indonesia introduced local content requirements for smartphones and forced local data storage. So it's a problem that is harmful. It's kind of the leading edge problem in trade and one that uniquely hurts the U.S. Clearly, import substitution, is also in a comeback mode for no reason at all. I mean, Modi has proclaimed it. This has basically been an obsolete business model since about the 1970s. The last country you can demonstrate using it successfully was South Korea, and they moved away from it very dramatically in the last 20 years to integrate with the world and make more globally competitive products. The Asia Pacific is littered with failures on import substitution. Go read about the Proton if you want to read about Malaysia's attempt at the automobile industry. But it does not work in our world today, the way global supply chains work and the way globally competitive products are made and marketed. So in any case, it is having a comeback, and you noticed. So.
And let me pull Rick in, because which of these bad things do you think India is most prone to? And then let me also tie in a TPP question for you, which is it possible within our lifetimes that India is going to join a TPP or even an RCEP? I mean, I'd take that. I mean, is India in any way interested in a sort of regional trade endeavor that it might be willing to make the
Yeah, as a
steps to get into.
non-specialist economist, right? I mean, Scott knows the differences between these things. I look at the three, and I think they all are pretty much the same thing, right? It's all propping up domestics in light of international competitors. And, you know, I think the day Modi came into office, May 2014, he inherited a number of these policies that Scott talked about. You know, they got a solar mission, defense, civil aviation, telecom, IT. There's other draft ones that have been brought up, which aren't enforced in total, but still are being adopted by some, you know, on power equipment, things like that. You know, for India, I mean, this is, it's essentially the list of the top products they import from China. India has a massive goods trade deficit that's equivalent to about 8% of GDP. And a couple of years ago, it was about 12% of GDP. Our trade deficit is, what, 2 or 3% of GDP. And you know the hair pulling that we've got over trade deficit. So, you know, India, this is a reaction, and we can all say that it's the improper, but it's a reaction to something they face that's very real. You know, do you block imports, or do you try to actually, you know, facilitate the growth of exports? They're doing a bit of that too, the Make in India campaign, but my complaint about that is they're aiming for high-tech industries. So if you want to create jobs and you want to offset your trade imbalance, aiming for high-tech, which is mostly, you know, factories run by robots, isn't exactly the way, at least for job creation. And there aren't very many examples of countries that have moved to the manufacturing either immediately, right? They tend to move up the value chain. And for India to say that semiconductors and things is going to be the thing they're going to start with, I mean, they got a pretty good auto industry, a very good generic pharmaceutical industry, but other than that, there aren't too many success stories. So Modi inherited a lot of these policies, and then he announces the Make in India campaign, and clearly a Make in India campaign does not comport with rolling these back, and he hasn't really done steps to do so. Although I did hear just in the last 24 hours, India, the way they procure defense material, there's been a draft floating around for some time, and I saw news reports that they're about to release or have released the final version of how they procure defense equipment, and under a certain threshold, they may no longer mandate domestic offsets. So maybe we see one small kernel, although I haven't seen the final policy on that yet. So overall, I think you're going to see a maintenance of these kind of policies in India. Maybe not a dramatic increase, but at least they'll maintain. A Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'll say this more broadly, and I was going to save this for the black swan, but you know, this could be one. You know, will India take the strategic decision that being pro-trade, which they're certainly not now, and joining trade agreements, you know, is that something where they could take a top-level decision in the next year and suddenly try to embrace? I think there's a chance. I'm not going to say it's above 50%. I'm not going to put $1 on the table at that table in Vegas for betting on international affairs, which we always talk about setting up. But I don't think they're going to do that. But there's a reasonable chance they will. And I'll tell you, there was a process that India undertook this year, which is really significant for a lot of the things that we care about, where we see India kind of pushing away from American policy on internet governance. India had traditionally adopted the China model, where every country develops its own. You don't need to talk to a lot of folks. You just come up with the rules of the road that you think are best. Middle of last year, India formally changed its position to adopt the same model that the United States is proposing for internet governance. How did they do that? Well, they had the Deputy National Security Advisor, the Foreign Secretary, and some other specialists come together and say, we need to think seriously about the policy that we've had on the cards and take something that was relegated to a relatively minor position within one of the ministries and actually take a senior level decision, what's in our most important strategic interest on internet governance. And they adopted the multi-stakeholder model. So we've seen a process here now where they take issues that get lodged at a low level and actually take a bigger, more strategic decision on that. There's rumblings on trade. I mean, when TPP was announced, you saw some noted commentators in India saying, oh, we got left out, we were excluded. They even said that about TTIP, by the way. Really smart people say, we got excluded from TTIP, you know. It's an interesting map to draw for India to be included in TTIP, but still, my retort always is, well, trade and services agreement, the expansion of ITA, these things were on the table. You could have joined. Well, we're going to be in RCEP. Well, I think we look at any grouping that India is a part of, including RCEP, is probably not going to be a great deal at this point. But in the next year, that's a potential black swan. I don't think they will, but there's an outside chance.
I had voted for D, so because I never follow directions, but I would, because the question's about 2016, and so I do think in the case of China, yes, we might see some innovation mercantilism in the form of greater Chinese investment in the semiconductor industry, these so-called private equity funds, so-called because they're not private, going up and acquiring lots of semiconductor firms around the world. But I don't see that. In 2016, I don't see industrial policy or this type of trade-related mercantilism taking off. What really concerns me about this year is global financial instability in Asia, and the type of bad policy mistakes that countries, including China, adopt as a response. Currency controls, intervention in their stock markets, the contagion effect that has, and then what that might have, the effect that might have on American policies that the Fed has with interest rates. I think that's where I'm most worried for this year.
Okay, well, that is an important issue, and I think because the time is short, we're going to spill 2 or 3 minutes over, but Will, why don't you put up the last two, or one before that one. Do the infrastructure one. I'd like to just get that on the table. Okay, so put your clickers back on. Who stands to benefit the most from the infrastructure rush in Asia? China, Japan, Korea, India, region, doesn't matter, U.S. loses? Another tough question. Okay, and so we have, I'm actually going to put the last question up as well, and then we can sort of flip between the two. So it looks like China's the winner here, and the region does reasonably well. Will, last question. Which black swans? Political instability in China, Asian financial crisis.
Wow. I thought we weren't supposed to be.
I thought it was supposed to be politically neutral here.
Okay. I wanted to include infrastructure in there because I think if you're interested in Asian economic affairs in 2016, I think you need to watch the infrastructure space. As you know, pretty much every country in the region that has money to spend or lend has announced, or maybe some who don't, have announced an infrastructure initiative. So China has obviously the One Belt, One Road, and the AIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank initiative, and others. Japan has its quality infrastructure push. And we have a Silk Road Fund. Various other players are playing in this space, and I think it's going to be a major area of contention. I'm happy to entertain comments or questions about it, but I think given the time, I think what I'll do is just say that, and say that, by the way, CSIS and including my program is going to be very involved in this question of infrastructure connectivity in Asia in 2016. All of us are going to be involved in this, so watch this space. We don't have a flashy video, but we will be involved in this during the year. And then on black swans, anybody from the panel want to take on any of these, and then we'll open this all up to the audience. Nobody wants. Okay, that's just as well. I'm just as happy to bring the audience in. I mean, I'm sure we all have things to say about each of those, but let's get the audience in. So questions about TPP, about trade, about infrastructure, about any of these big risks out there. Yes, sir. And then that gentleman back there. I'll take 3 or 4. I didn't look over here last time.
Hi, Ed Stewart from WIC Global Partners. I guess this question's for Mr. Miller on TPP. You did a very good job of sort of laying out the sequence and timeline here in Washington, but could you comment on what the art and science of passage in the other capitals would be in terms of the sequence? Are they going to go before or after the U.S.? And is there any chance of any other country potentially rejecting TPP?
And if I can just supplement that to the panel here, and particularly Ernie, you know, who's next in terms of other countries that might be interested in joining TPP or likely to join TPP? If we could sort of bundle. Wait, before you answer that, Scott, let's take the other couple of questions. There was a gentleman way in the back there, and then Paula again, and then
gentleman you know, Matt. Willie Wilson, Wilson International. My question's about infrastructure, and you can answer it in a few months if you want instead. Will there be sufficient domestic reforms in the different countries to enable private development of infrastructure to increase its share, however large or small, compared to public investment? Thank you.
And then Paula. Anyone over here? Last chance. Going. Okay. go ahead.
Thanks again. Paula Stern again. TPP and Scott, lame duck, I didn't hear the word, which I've been writing this now for quite a long time, that we'll get a TPP only in a lame duck, if or not at all. So I'd like you to just comment on that, because I was surprised you didn't mention it. I think it's the best thing for the country, easiest for the members who will be past their election, and then you usher in 2016 with a president who has cleared that off her desk, and I'd like to hear your comments.
Carly Fiorina is doing that well? I didn't know that.
Sure. Let me start with the lame duck question, because I have a point of view. It's actually different than yours, which is, look, lame duck sessions have a special name for a reason. They are weird. They are unpredictable. They are short. You have seated members of Congress who, many of whom won't face the voters again, so, and a substantial number who just lost their elections. And believe me, they're grouchy. They don't want to be here, okay? So I would say that first, the file cabinets of Washington, D.C. are filled with bills that were supposed to pass in the lame duck session and didn't over the years. Second, in my personal experience over the last 20 years, the only trade bill that did not pass was a bill that was put up in the lame duck session. In 2006, after the House flipped from Republican to Democrat, John Boehner put on the suspension calendar permanent normal trade relations with Vietnam. Should have been a layup. It failed and had to be passed under regular order later in that same weird lame duck session. They're very unpredictable. They're hard to manage. And if you have a change in power, they get short. They get very difficult to manage. So I wouldn't plan on it. Stranger things have happened. Okay, but for me, that is one of the less likely outcomes. More likely is you would have what happened, for instance, in NAFTA, where the Bush administration signed it, the Clinton administration came into office, modified it somewhat, marginally, but modified it to suit them, and then pushed it forward. I think that's a more likely outcome. On the question of sequencing and other parties, I'll plead ignorance about other political calendars, and that I would note that. If you read the last chapter of the agreement, the TPP really only enters into force if Japan and the United States pass, given the way the math works of TPP. So if either Japan or the United States fails to ratify, TPP does not enter into force. If those two do ratify, then if one of the other parties doesn't, it's inconsequential. It enters into force without them. But Ernie's probably the better.
Let me just, before putting Ernie here, on Japan, I think that's correct. Japan is really I mean, it's larger than all the other 10 members of TPP combined, and because of this entry into force provision, it is Japan that really matters. I think the bottom line is Japan, will pass TPP. I don't think there's much risk given Abe's and the LDP's control over both houses. I think there was some question and discomfort in Japan about having to vote on this before their upper house elections this summer. I think the LDP and Abe would have gone ahead and done this anyway, but it would have been risky in front of that election. If it gets delayed till after that, then I think it's a fairly comfortable vote. But obviously there is opposition in Japan. It's not going to be without a political cost to Abe. What about other parliaments that are in this current TPP, and then extending my question about who else? I mean, Philippines, any other members of your group that might join?
Timing matters here, so that's an important caveat on all this. And I'm only going to do the Asian countries, the non-Japan Asian countries, because I don't know really about Latin America. I think you would have proactively countries in Southeast Asia approving the agreement to show leadership. I don't think they'll be as cagey as the Japanese in timing with the United States, with the exception of Malaysia, possibly. I think that Singapore is the canary in the coal mine on trade. They're trade dependent. Trade is 300% or more of GDP. So they'll show everyone what to do and probably go ahead and approve. I think the Chinese have continue to defeat themselves with their actions in the South China Sea. So I think the Vietnamese will probably approve the trade agreement after the Party Congress, which is happening next week. Yep, no, this week, starting this week. And once they get their new team in place. But the Politburo and the die is cast even more so because of what the Chinese are doing. The Vietnamese see this not only as economically important, but geopolitically critical. And I think the Bruneians will also follow in that pattern. Malaysia is less sure. I mean, I think if you leave this out there and you don't pass it this year, I think things get harder. But I think Najib needs an economic reform win. He needs alignment with the international community. He's struggling for his political survival within the Malaysian political context. So I think if he thinks there's an opportunity to pass it soon, he probably would. And I know they are sizing that up in the Malaysian parliament right now. Countries coming up, I think Korea would be in front of the line, Matt. Would you say yes? Yep. And then for Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Thailand have both said that they would do this. Again, timing's important. Aquino is out as president because he's term limited to one term. There's an election in May, and the Philippine presidential race, we had the vice president here who's now leading in the polls, Binay. Speaking at CSIS, he said he was in favor of TPP for the Philippines, but somehow political campaigns change your mind sometimes. So we'll see on that one. And then I think the Thais are going to need a way back towards integration into the global economy, but that won't happen before I think their political crisis is sort of worked through, which I think that will be one we see this year. And then Indonesia is a real long shot, although Jokowi, when he was in the Oval Office, told President Obama that he wanted Indonesia to be in the TPP. So let's take him at his word and move Indonesia toward that direction, but a longer shot.
I think that's the right trajectory of other countries. I don't think anybody thinks that any new member is going to be considered for accession until at least well into 2017, even under the most optimistic scenario of passage here and in other places. And frankly, it'll take a new president here, probably realistically. I mean, every member, existing member, has to approve a new member, but frankly, the U.S. is going to be critical in that, and I think it's going to take a new president 9 months just to get his or her team in place. So I think it's going to be probably a 2018 proposition, really, which is therefore for a new Korean president, for example. Just a quick question to Scott. Yes or no question. Will China ever join TPP?
TPP as TPP?
I meant Scott.
Wrong, Scott.
Go ahead.
Wrong. You go first. You go first.
TPP as TPP? No. Some alternative arrangement, which includes both the Western Hemisphere and the Asia Pacific? Perhaps.
Scott. Scott.
No on TPP. Yes, in 10 to 15 years at a multilateral level of something that was born out of TPP.
Okay, just quickly on infrastructure, we are going to be spending some of this time demythifying some of the things about infrastructure, one of which is that the reality is, as you know, Willie, most infrastructure is funded domestically, so all these international initiatives are interesting, but they're not where most infrastructure is actually built in countries, and it's mostly paid for by the public sector, and that's also true internationally. MDBs do most of the funding, but another myth, there is a huge pool of potential private sector money that would invest in this activity if there were good, solid, bankable projects to invest in, and that's a function of long-term returns. It's a function of a sound political environment, of an ability to acquire land, an ability to ensure that you don't have to pay bribes, cutting through all kinds of bureaucratic barriers, and so. One of the myths about this area of human endeavor is that there isn't enough money. There is money, but the money has to be liberated to go into this investment by a potential for real return, and that's a function of all these really difficult issues. It's hard enough. I see Peter over there, Peter Kelly. If you think about how hard the Big Dig was to get done in Boston, imagine trying to build something, a tunneled road through, Kazakhstan or something. I mean, it's not an easy proposition for 100 reasons. So, but to be continued, we're going to do much more on infrastructure, so good question. Let me just say before wrapping up that I think we didn't give enough time and attention to answer B there, the Asian financial crisis. I'm glad Scott Kennedy mentioned it and it's been touched on, but that's obviously one that I think we all have to be a little more concerned about this week than 2 weeks ago. I'm not predicting it. I'm not suggesting you run out and sell everything. In fact, this might be a buying opportunity, but I just think that is something that we should reserve some time in future events and conversations about the risks here, because I think they're substantial and potentially growing here. But with that, I'm sorry to have to wrap up, but we're a little over time as it is. Let me first ask you to all thank our panelists for their contributions. Thank you. Thank Will Colson, the guy who made the clickers work. And again, we'll come after you if you take one of these home with you. So please leave it on your chair. And thank you very much. We're going to be continuing a lot of this stuff throughout the year, and please come back and visit.